Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my March wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of March. So I read 12 things in the month of March, all of which I really enjoyed. I had quite a few rereads this month, and it was also a very historical fiction heavy month, which I really enjoyed. But before I get into all the historical fiction I read this month, let me start off with a few classics. So I read a couple of classics this month, mostly rereads. So I finished rereading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I don't even know how many times I've read Pride and Prejudice now, probably somewhere between 12 and 15 times. But I tend to listen to it on audiobook at least once a year. And I started listening to Pride and Prejudice on audiobook I think back in January, like when I had a really bad migraine. When I have a migraine, all I really want to do is lie down in a darkened room and listen to something comforting and familiar, and then I have just been listening to bits of Pride and Prejudice here and there if I have a headache or while going to sleep or whatever since then. And I finished off my reread in March, and I really enjoyed my reread, as I always do. I love Pride and Prejudice a lot. It's such a comfort read for me. It's so fun and delightful and just thoroughly enjoyable. You may well know quite a lot about Pride and Prejudice already because it's, you know, pretty famous, but this is a wonderful novel from 1813 about the Bennet family, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and their 5 daughters. Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed on the male line, which means that his family will have nowhere to live and no way to support themselves unless some of his daughters marry well. And this book chiefly follows the 2 eldest daughters, Elizabeth and Jane, and their kind of romantic relationship, as well as the sort of complicated, difficult position of women at this time. It is just a truly fantastic novel, one of the best love stories ever, but also just so funny and so quick and clever, and I just adore it, and every time I read it, it just makes me so happy. Moving on to 1857 and another reread. This month I reread Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. This book is March and April's pick for the Mega Dickens Read-Along, which I'll leave some more information about down below in the description. The Mega Dickens Read-Along is a 2-year readathon where we're reading the works of Charles Dickens in publication order, and we are getting nearer to the end now, which is kind of exciting. And this is also kind of my pick for the readathon March of the Mammoths in March as well, this being a pretty hefty book. So I listened to this on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Juliet Stevenson. I think it's like 40 something hours long, but I just really enjoyed listening to it. I love Little Dorrit a lot. It's one of my favourite Dickens books, and I have read it several times before. I will be making an individual like reflections review video on this at some point in the next few weeks, so I will go into more detail there. But basically this novel is the story of a young woman called Amy Dorrit. She is 22 years old, and her father is imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison for debt. He's been there for over 20 years. Amy Dorrit was born inside the Marshalsea prison, and this book kind of kicks off when Amy Dorrit meets a man called Arthur Clenham, who's just come back from working abroad for 20 years and finds that Amy Dorrit is working as a seamstress in his mother's house. They kind of strike up a friendship, and everything goes on from there. There is so much that I love about Little Dorrit. It's one of my favourite Dickens books, and it's just so wonderful. I love the plot and the structure and the twists and turns of it. I love Amy Dorrit as a character so much, and I love Arthur Clenham. I feel like those two are probably my favourite protagonists in all of Dickens. Like, I feel like there are other Dickens characters who maybe I love more, but they tend to be the minor characters. I think Little Dorrit has my favourite central characters of any Dickens book. It has a wonderful love story in it, and the themes of unrequited love and money and class are so interesting, and I just love it a lot. So highly recommend Little Dorrit. I think it's a wonderful book. Before I move on to the historical fiction I read in March, which will be the rest of this video, I have one other classic I read which I want to quickly mention. I won't talk about it for very long because it was a short story, and that was The Letter by W. Somerset Maugham. So I read this because I read a work of historical fiction inspired by this, which we'll talk about next. But The Letter by W. Somerset Maugham is a short story from 1922. It's set in Singapore, and it's about a lawyer and his clerk like puzzling out the evidence after a murder has been committed. This was the first thing by W. Somerset Maugham that I've read. I found it quite interesting, although to be honest, I feel like I mostly found it really interesting in relation to the novel I had just read that was inspired by it, so it's a bit hard for me to like separate my interest in the story from the like quite odd and specific reason why I was reading it, but I did find it kind of interesting and it was something I read this month, so I thought I would mention it. Let me move on to the historical fiction because I read a lot of historical fiction in the month of March. So I'm currently reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list. This is something I tend to do every year. I really love the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction and I like to read as much from the long list as I can. So 5 of the books I read in March were books from that long list. I have done separate review videos of these books kind of bunched up in 3s, so I'll link those videos down below and I won't go into as much depth here. So the first of the Walter Scott Prize books I want to talk about today is The House of Doors by Tan Truong Eng. Tan Truong Eng is a Malaysian writer and this novel is set in Malaysia in the 1920s and 1910s, and it follows quite a few different characters and quite a few different threads, but it mostly focuses on what happens when W. Somerset Maugham, the author, comes to visit Penang in the 1920s and stays with 2 old friends, Leslie and Robert. And while W. Somerset Maugham is staying with them, Leslie tells him the story of some things that happened to her back in the 1910s, including her getting involved with the Chinese nationalist movement when Sun Yat-sen came to visit Penang, her discovery that her husband was having an affair, and what happened when her friend was accused of murder. And the idea behind The House of Doors is that this novel is like the true story of the events that inspired the W. Somerset Maugham short story, The Letter. Hence why I read The Letter this month as well. I really enjoyed The House of Doors. I thought it was a really interesting, intriguing novel with a lot of really interesting threads and an interesting look both at a particular point in history but also at the theme of inspiration and where authors get their ideas from, I guess. Like, it's a very interesting book to read side by side with the short story The Letter because it's not the same story at all, but Tan Truong Eng has thought really carefully about like where different elements of that short story could have come from and kind of turned it into this novel. As I said in my review video, I do think The House of Doors is probably a little bit more literary than my usual taste, and it's one of those novels that has like a lot of different themes and a lot of different threads, and I didn't always feel like I knew what the centre was, but I think that's very much a personal reading taste thing, and I think if you're someone who enjoys authors like Sarah Winman, then I think you'll really like The House of Doors. My favourite book that I have read so far for the Walter Scott Prize, probably my favourite book of the month, possibly my favourite book of the year so far, was Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. This fantastic novel spans from the Anglo-Saxon period to 2019 and tells the story of the legacy of St Cuthbert, an Anglo-Saxon bishop, a monk, through various different stories and various different characters and through various different forms. We have poetry, we have scripts, we have regular prose, we have diary entries, we have chapters that are made up of lots of different sentences from lots of different other sources. It's very hard to do this justice in a wrap-up, so I will link my other video down below where I spoke about Cuddy at a lot greater length, but I basically just thought this book was truly fantastic, innovative, clever, exceptionally powerful. Like, for a book that experiments with form and does a lot of really like original different things, it would be very easy for this book to be like all about the craft and the writing and not about the stories, but actually it is a novel that is also very much about the stories and the characters and the individual stories we get in here, and the characterization is so rich and there were so many bits I found so moving and so compelling, and I just absolutely adored this. I don't think it'll be for everyone because it is quite experimental, but personally I just loved it, and I feel like this is the kind of experimental that I really love, because Cuddy as a book is one of those works of historical fiction that is not just a book set in the past, it is a book about history and about how we understand history and how we interpret the past through stories. And I just thought that was such a joy, and I just loved it so much. And yeah, this was such a fantastic book. I want this to win the Walter Scott Prize, and I really hope it does, because it deserves to. What a great book. Another book I read for the Walter Scott Prize long list was this. This is Hungry Ghosts by Kevin Jarrett Hussein. This book is set in Trinidad in the 1940s, and it follows the complicated, dysfunctional relationships between a couple of different families. in this neighborhood there is a husband and wife who are very wealthy, and when the husband disappears, the wife decides that she doesn't feel safe on her own, so she employs one of the men who usually works on her husband's land to kind of be a night watchman. So this man Hans leaves behind his wife and son, Shweta and Krishna, more or less for 2 weeks in order to become this night watchman. And this decision to take on this job kind of leads to a series of tragic, complex events. I'll leave my review video for this down in the description because I went into more detail there. But this book is one of those ones that feels a little bit like a Greek tragedy, in that one event kind of leads to another until we have this sort of terrible sequence of awful events. There was so much in this book I thought was fantastically done. The theme of grief was really well done. The theme of kind of violence and violence passed down through generations. The exploration of this small community and kind of the difficult situations that poverty leaves people in. I just thought it was so fantastic and so well done, and I really recommend it. The next book I want to speak about is My Father's House by Joseph O'Connor. This was another book from the Walter Scott Prize longlist, and it was also one of my picks for the Irish Readathon in March. This book is set in Rome in the Second World War in 1943, when Rome was occupied by Nazi forces, but the Vatican, being a separate country, was technically neutral and therefore had like a slightly different status. And this book follows an Irish priest who lives in the Vatican and is kind of part of the resistance movement. He has formed an escape line trying to get escaped prisoners of war and other people who are in danger out of the city. And this book I thought was really, really great, really pacey, really dramatic, with fantastic writing and great characterization. I really loved the way it was told. We have these sections that are in third person just following the Irish priest Hugh, and then we have these other sections in first person looking back from like 20 years in the future, told from the perspective of all the different people who were involved in the escape line. And I thought that was just really well done and was so effective. I did find a few elements of the ending like a little bit slow, but in general I thought this was great and definitely worth a read. Then the other book I read for the Walter Scott Prize longlist this month was For Thy Great Pain Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie. This was a reread for me. I read it last year, and in fact I realised while I was rereading it that I read it in March last year because it was a book that I used for the Herstory-a-thon last year. So I guess it also counts for the Herstory-a-thon this year, even though I did read it last year. But basically I had read this last year, but a full year ago, and I wanted to talk about it in a bit more depth because, you know, I've been reviewing the books for the Walter Scott Prize longlist and it's so short, so I thought I would just reread it. And I actually got the audiobook out the library. It was only like 3 hours long, so I just went through it very fast, and the audiobook was fantastic. I'd really recommend the audiobook because it is just so well voice acted and really powerful, and just really like upped all the emotions fantastically for me. So this is a strange, slightly odd novella that I really love. It tells a story of two women in 15th century England, Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kempt, both of whom were real historical figures. Julian of Norwich was an anchoress, so she was basically a kind of nun who had isolated herself from society. She saw visions of Jesus Christ and wrote a book about this. And Marjorie Kempt was a wife and mother of 14 children who also had visions, religious visions, and she also wrote an autobiography later in life. So these two women kind of wrote two very important medieval texts, and this novel is basically just looking at their lives and imagining a meeting between them. And I just really love how this book looks at the position of women at this point in time, and how these women who are not really wanted by society kind of finds some form of peace in religion, I guess. And I don't think you have to be religious at all to enjoy this book. I'm not, but I think it's a really interesting look at religion and faith and family and womanhood in the 15th century, and I just think it's great. So yeah, I really like this one too. I really loved reading it last year, but I think I liked listening to it even more, so I really do recommend the audiobook. It was fantastic. Then I read 4 other works of historical fiction this month which weren't for the Walter Scott Prize. So one of these was Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue. I wanted to pick this up in March for the Irish Readathon and also for the Herstory-a-thon because Emma Donoghue's an Irish writer, and this book is about real historical female figures from the past, which is what the Herstory-a-thon is all about. I have just now realised that I read 2 books for the Irish Readathon by Irish authors, neither of which are set in Ireland. This one isn't even about Irish characters, but Anyway, I really loved Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue. I love all of Emma Donoghue's books. I have read 5 of her books now, I think, and she's just an author who I really, really enjoy. I feel like her books are always just a really reliable, great quality. So this novel is set in the early 19th century. In fact, it's set in kind of 2 timelines. We have in 1815 letters from Eliza Reign to Anne Lister, and then in 1805 to 1806, we follow Anne Lister and Eliza Reign when they are like 14, 15 years old at school. So in the 1805 to 1806 section, we are following Eliza Reign, who is a 14-year-old schoolgirl. Her mother was Indian, her father was British. She grew up for the first 6 years of her life in India, but moved to England for her education. She's now an orphan, very aware of her kind of complicated social status, being both illegitimate and a person of colour. And she is at this school trying really hard to follow the rules and kind of just get through her education when a new girl arrives at school, and Anne Lister is kind of sent to share her room with Eliza Reign, and we basically follow the course of their friendship and what happens when these 2 young teenage girls fall in love. I found this novel really interesting for many reasons. It's set in a time period that I find fascinating. I'm also really interested in like education in the past and the way this book looked at like school in the early 19th century and what girls were being taught and how those lessons worked. Like all of that stuff was really fascinating. I also loved reading a fictional version of Anne Lister. I read a lot of Anne Lister's diaries last year, and I feel like I know her quite well as a person. I mean, can you ever really? But reading Anne Lister's diaries, you do get a very strong sense of her as a person, much more than anyone else's diaries I've ever read. And in this book, we're following Anne Lister at like 14, 15, several years before we have any records of her diaries, but you get such a strong sense of her as the person she became. And the thing about Anne Lister that you know from her diaries, if you've read them, is that Anne Lister is both fascinating and sort of exceptionally charismatic, but also like sometimes quite mean and quite self-involved and a complete snob. And I feel like this book just captured all the complexities of Anne Lister so well, but also Eliza herself is such a fascinating character, and I loved reading about Eliza. I feel like I've mostly focused on the kind of 1805 to 1806 passages when the girls are teenagers, where basically what we're getting is a kind of first love story. But within this novel, we also have letters from Eliza Reign to Anne Lister in 1815, 10 years on, when she is living in an asylum, having had a kind of nervous breakdown. And so this kind of young love story is always overshadowed by the sorrow that is to come later in Eliza's life, and by the question, did Anne Lister cause that? And so that gives the novel this kind of real somber feel, while we're also just watching these 2 girls fall in love in a really like innocent, nice way. So I thought that was like a really interesting juxtaposition that for me worked very well. I don't know whether you would love it as much if you don't know anything about Anne Lister's life and you haven't read her diaries, but to be honest, I still think it's a great book regardless. I also found the author's note at the back really, really interesting, where Emma Donoghue talks, quite a lot about Anne Lister, but also about Eliza Reign, who was also a real historical figure, and kind of what we know about her life and kind of her struggles with mental health, or, to what extent she had struggles with mental health, or was just, considered unconventional in society and therefore ended up living in an asylum. And, how can we even judge that from this distance of time? But I just thought this novel was, so fantastically done and really, really interesting, and definitely one I recommend. Then another work of historical fiction I read, which would actually also count for the Herstory Readathon, is The King's Witches by Kate Foster. This is a proof copy. This novel is coming out in June, and I really recommend it. It is fantastic. It's been really nice to see over the last month or so more people talking about Kate Foster on BookTube, because her debut novel, The Maiden, has been longlisted for the Women's Prize, and this is her second novel, which is coming out in June, and I'm really, really excited for it to be out in the world because I loved it a lot. So this book is set in Denmark and Scotland in the late 16th century, and we're following 3 very different women. Princess Anna of Denmark, who is travelling to Scotland to be married to King James VI of Scotland. Her lady's maid, Kirsten, who is a kind of quite mysterious figure who you get to know more about as the novel goes on, and she was probably my favourite character. I thought she was done so well. And then we're also following Jura, a young Scottish girl who ends up getting accused of witchcraft. And this book is a fascinating novel with well-drawn characters and a really intriguing, interesting plot. I think one of the things I loved most about this is that it kind of combined exploration of the witch trials in Scotland at this point in time with a really interesting look at like court intrigue and the complications of the royal court at this time, and I thought all of that stuff was done really well and kind of came together fantastically. And one thing that I really liked in both The King's Witches and The Maiden is that Kate Foster kind of starts off the novel pushing your attention towards one character, and then as both novels go on, your attention kind of gets drawn towards other characters, and it shifts the kind of balance in a really cool way. So yeah, I really like this novel. It's coming out in June, and I definitely recommend it, and I definitely recommend her first book, The Maiden, too. Then this month I also read The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, which I really loved. This was the last Sarah Waters book that I had to read, and I do feel slightly like sad that there are no more Sarah Waters books to read. I mean, I'm hoping she'll write another one at some point, and then there will be more, but it does feel odd, having been reading Sarah Waters like slowly one a year, buddy reading them all with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, it does feel quite weird that we've now like got to the end of the Sarah Waters books, at least for now. So yes, I read The Little Stranger in March, and I really, really enjoyed it. I thought this was such an intriguing, atmospheric, compelling, fascinating novel, and one I will be thinking about for a really long time. So The Little Stranger is set very shortly after the Second World War, and we're following a doctor called Dr. Faraday who's living in a small town in Warwickshire. Dr. Faraday, as a doctor, kind of occupies a sort of middle-class position, but his background is very much a working-class background, and he is very, very conscious of that and conscious of how that excludes him from certain elements of society. And by chance, he ends up at the beginning of the novel being called to Hundreds Hall, which is the kind of grand manor house of the local gentry, and he's summoned there when the one live-in servant says that she is ill. Hundreds Hall is a massive crumbling house that is really struggling to modernise. The family, a mother and her two grown-up children, are living in this massive crumbling house that they can't afford to maintain. They have one live-in servant, one day servant, and the grounds are sprawling and massive, and they are really struggling to kind of keep up the house and themselves in the style and class that they would be expected to. Many years ago, Dr. Faraday's mother was a servant at Hundreds Hall, and this makes him kind of fascinated by Hundreds Hall as a place, and also by the Ayres family who live there. And after he has treated the young maid, he ends up treating Roderick, the son, who has come home from the war with severe injuries to his leg. And over the course of several months, Dr. Faraday becomes more and more kind of enmeshed in life at Hundreds Hall. And meanwhile, strange, mysterious, potentially ghostly things are kind of happening around the house. But Dr. Faraday is a doctor and a man of science, so of course he doesn't believe in poltergeists or any of that stuff. But what exactly is going on at Hundreds Hall? And everything goes on from there. I really loved The Little Stranger. There were so many fascinating things in this book. The way this book looks at class is really interesting, and the characterization in it was just fantastic. Like, Dr. Faraday and all of the others are just so complex and nuanced and messy and fascinating. There's also something about Sarah Waters' writing style that I just find like exceptionally compelling. Like, some of her books are very fast-paced all the way through, and some are kind of like slow burn and then something changes and the pace picks up. This, I would say, is very much like a slow build in that it starts slow, but then at some point it gets fast, and then suddenly you just can't stop reading. Like, I find her writing just exceptionally compelling. Like, there's just a real intensity to the atmosphere of Sarah Waters' books. And that is very much the case in The Little Stranger. So yeah, I very much love this book, and I would really recommend it. It was a fantastic read. Finally, I read one other work of historical fiction in March, and that was another reread, and that was Death and the Conjurer by Tom Mead. I read Death and the Conjurer for the first time maybe only 6 months ago, but me and my husband Nick had a long drive to go on, and I like to listen to audiobooks while I'm driving, but only if it's a reread, only if it's something I've read before, and Nick hadn't read Death and the Conjurer, and I thought he'd really like it. So we listened to it together, and we both really enjoyed it. There is something really fun about rereading a murder mystery and like spotting all the clues that you missed the first time. So Death and the Conjurer is a historical murder mystery set in the 1930s, and it is a locked room mystery. Well, in fact, 2 locked room mysteries. So first, a psychiatrist is murdered in his house. The windows were locked, the doors were locked. It's unclear how he has been killed. But his 3 patients, his daughter and his daughter's fiance, are kind of like first on the suspect pool. Meanwhile, at a party on the other side of London, a very valuable painting is stolen from a locked room, and we follow the police detective who is trying to solve this case. But because locked room mysteries are very difficult, he calls upon an old friend of his, Joseph Spector, who is a theatre illusionist and conjurer, who understands how tricks are performed. And these 2 kind of team up to solve the murder mystery. I really, really love Death and the Conjurer. It's very fun, very clever, with great characterization and a really wonderful tone. It's kind of hard to explain like the tone of a book until you've read it, but there's a very fun, like knowing, slightly meta tone to the narrative voice. It's third person, but the kind of authorial voice kind of occasionally intrudes to comment on the situation. A bit like Anthony Trollope does, actually. So I feel like if you enjoy that in Anthony Trollope's books and you like murder mysteries, then you might really enjoy Death and the Conjurer. This is the start of a series, and I'm really excited to read the second book in the series, The Murder Wheel, which I'm probably going to read in the next month or so, and also to read the third book, which is coming out later this year. In general, I'm just really enjoying this series so far, and I'm really enjoying getting more into historical murder mysteries. So those are the 12 books that I read in March. I feel like I've been talking for ages. I feel like everything I read in March was just something I had quite a lot to say about, but I read some fantastic books this month. So do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, what was your favourite book you read in March. And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.